Hello, guys. My name is Ruby. Now, I am 17, though recently I didn't even have hope that I'd live to be 16. We all tend to believe that bad things can happen to anyone, but not us. And when they happen to you, there's only one question you have in your mind: why me? It all struck me when I was going through one of the most important periods of my life. I lived with my mom. My father had left us many years ago for another woman. So modern. That was a heavy blow for both my mother and for me, but we got over it. I was finishing school that year, so I was bogged down with my studies. I was absolutely exhausted every single minute. Sometimes I didn't have enough energy to have breakfast or to take a shower in the morning, but neither my mom nor I paid much attention to it. I prepared for my exams day and night. Who wouldn't be tired? But it was not that easy. One night I went downstairs to get some water, but suddenly I realized everything went dark. And when I opened my eyes, I saw my mom's worried face. I realized I was lying on the floor in the middle of the kitchen. My poor mother got so scared, she even called an ambulance. Even though I knew I was at risk of having genetic heart problems on my mother's side, I wasn't worried about it. The doctor examined me and said it would be better to have a more careful examination. I spent 2 days in the hospital, but for some reason, doctors kept asking me to go through another test or examination again and again. When I tried to convince them it was all about my school and exams, they were very evasive and didn't answer eagerly. But I have to admit, I didn't really feel well. I had more than enough rest procrastinating in my hospital bed, but I was still so exhausted, it was hard for me to move. Finally, doctors gave me the answer to why this was happening to me. I was diagnosed with a very rare heart condition. To cut the story short, my heart was not able to function normally anymore, and I needed a heart transplant as soon as possible. But that was not the worst thing. It had gotten so bad, I didn't have any time to wait for a donor. It all came right out of the blue, but before I was able to process the whole thing, my cardiologist suggested that I undergo a very risky surgery, which was the only way to prolong my life. I had to have my heart removed and replaced with a totally artificial heart made of biocompatible plastic. I knew what that meant. I would have to spend endless days bedridden and waiting for a donor. And of course, I was not the first person on the transplant list, but since my tears of sorrow were not helping at all, I agreed. The surgery was successful, but it was so weird to wake up having 2 tubes coming out of my stomach attached to the pump. And I remember that I thought, that's it, game over. But the good news was that I actually didn't have to stay in bed all the time. Doctors said that I would even be able to go home after I was used to living with my new heart. So I did my best to recover as soon as possible, and I was ready to go home a month later, which was a great victory for me. My mom and my friends were so loving and supportive that I almost felt happy again. I was given a smaller pump that I could fit in my bag and even go outside for a while, but I always had to make sure that the batteries were charged. My friends called me Ruby as a joke because when we went out together, I always had to be near a plug. Step by step, I was making my way back to my normal life. I was determined to get back to my studies, but since I couldn't go to school anymore, my mom offered to homeschool me. Things were getting better, but one day changed everything. I was sitting at home waiting for my math tutor when I got a call. When I picked up the phone, I heard a familiar voice, which I hadn't heard for at least 7 years. It was my father. I hadn't talked to him or seen him since he had left us many years ago. I just froze with the phone in my hand. But before I was able to say something, he told me the worst news ever. He said he had gotten a call from the hospital. My mom got sick at work and possibly had a stroke. My father suggested meeting on the subway and going to the hospital together. My stomach just dropped. I was about to rush out the door when I remembered I hadn't charged my batteries yet. I had only 1 hour, but I could not leave my mom out there. I counted. 1 hour had to be enough, so I grabbed my backpack with the pump and headed to the subway all alone. My father didn't know what had happened to me, otherwise he would never have let me do it. But at that moment, it was for the best. I saw my father from far away, and while I was approaching him, I was trying to think about what I was going to tell him and what he was going to tell me after all these years. Even though I had no heart, I felt like it was breaking into little pieces. My father recognized me, and I thought I saw invisible tears on his face. We both stayed quiet for a minute, staring at each other, and then got on the train. My father was so emotional to see me, he hadn't even noticed 2 tubes coming out from under my clothes. The train was going, and we still couldn't make conversation. Suddenly, we stopped in the tunnel. It happens from time to time, but it had been 5 minutes, then 10, and the train still didn't move. Then it was finally announced there were some technical problems and passengers would have to wait for a while. But how long was that while? And then we all heard a loud noise. It was like a siren or something. I realized the noise was coming out of my backpack. I opened it and saw the batteries were almost low. The doctors told me there was going to be a loud signal to remind me, so it meant I had no more than 20 minutes left, and I was stuck on the train in the middle of a tunnel. My father asked me about the noise, so I had to confess, and I told him the whole story. The train was full of people, so he was not the only person to become aware of my situation. People were trying to help while my dad was talking to the train driver. One guy offered me a power bank, which bought me a little more time. My father was in a panic. After he had managed to explain everything to the subway workers, we were both evacuated. We ran to the closest cafe to charge the batteries, and we both agreed to not tell Mom this story. It was almost the way we did many years ago, when I ate all the candy or spilled Mom's perfume. I think we both suddenly flooded with warm memories and got over all of our hard feelings. When we finally got to the hospital, Mom was awake. She was feeling okay. Luckily, this time it was just fainting with no irreversible consequences. No wonder. It must have been a hard time for her too, even though she never used to put her emotions on display. I was really worried about what her reaction was going to be when she saw my dad. My mother hated him and never even talked about him all those years. But it went better than I had expected. We all even went out to eat together, but when we were saying goodbye, she coldly thanked him for helping me and asked him to never show up again. He was the same traitor for her, but for me, not anymore. We started texting each other and even secretly met a couple of times. He asked me so many questions about my health and even asked if he could take a look at my test results. He would accompany me on my weekly examinations at the hospital and talk to the doctors all the time. It made me feel so loved and needed. At some point, I even thought that was why this all had to happen. I had to lose my heart to get my father back. Time went on. One morning I woke up to see my mother's bulging eyes. She was shaking me like crazy and screaming, "We've got a donor! Ruby, we've got a donor!" I couldn't believe my ears. We had to get to the hospital as soon as possible. I wanted to tell my father this good news, so I texted him in the car. I decided not to call him in front of my mom. When we got to the hospital, everything happened very fast. Doctors immediately started preparing me for the surgery, so I didn't even have time to ask who the donor was. When I opened my eyes, I almost cried to see that there were no more tubes in my stomach and no more batteries and pumps. I was not heartless anymore. My mom was sitting next to my bed, and she also started crying when I woke up. I was expecting my dad to be there as well, but he was not. I asked my mother if she knew anything about him, but she was just looking at me and crying, not being able to say anything. But then she made herself tell me the truth. It turned out the heart that was beating in my chest now was actually my father's heart. He had a rare hematology disease called thrombocytopenia. It causes a hemorrhagic stroke and clinical death in the deeper stages. My father made an agreement with his doctor in mind that when it happened, his heart would be given to me. You can't imagine how heartbreaking it was to know that. That was not how I wanted it to be at all. It was even more heartbreaking to read the note that he had left for me. It said, "Live the happiest life you can, and let my heart always be with you." This is what I'm trying to do today. I finished school, and I got into the college I wanted. I got acquainted with my father's family, and sometimes my little half-brother and sister asked me to let them listen to Dad's heartbeat. Of course, it is still hard for me, but I realize my dad would be gone anyway, and there was no better way but to continue his life inside me. I hope you find the story inspiring, even though it is bittersweet at the same time. If you can, make sure you share it with your friends. I would also be happy to read your stories in the comments.